I'm very excited to introduce the Socratic Dialogue, and I'm very excited to facilitate this today. And as Sandy said, I'm not a architect or an engineer. I come from a very different background, so I'm very excited to kind of see the responses that we get to the dialogue. So a Socratic dialogue is a method of philosophical inquiry that engages in an almost conversational approach with others to explore typically complex ideas and concepts. The core is to reach a deeper understanding of a topic through dialectical discussion. So this is a dialogue, it's not a debate. We are not here to kind of change each other's minds. We are here to kind of get to the root of everybody's thinking and to get an understanding of what lies beneath an issue. This is a process that requires discipline and active participation from both the panel and the audience. So we are going to create a free and a safe space for all the participants to share their thoughts to the question, to make or to mend. That is the question. So the format of this dialogue is it's going to be a statement dialogue. So I'm kind of going to explain the process a little bit. It might seem slightly convoluted now, but I think when we get into it, it will definitely make sense. So we have our panelists who are asked to come to the front in a minute. They will be presenting for 5 minutes to the question. And after each statement, the audience and the panel, you will be given 1 minute to write an open and informative question. I'm kind of going to explain what that means in a minute. So once we have those questions, the first question round, each panelist will pose one question to one of the other panelists. There will then be no follow-up questions to the response. We'll then go into the second question round. So each panelist can now ask their follow-up question, or they can ask one of their initial questions. And again, there will be no follow-up questions allowed. Now we're going to go into the question dialogue, which will the floor will be open to the audience. So during those 1 minute sessions, you'll also be asked to think of some questions potentially. So open and informative questions. Why, what, who, where, when, and how? Why do you think that? What do you mean by that? What did you do then? We will not be allowing any judgmental questions. We will not allow for any steering. So when you want to ask your questions, you can't give quite a long paragraph. You have to go straight in. And we also are not going to allow for any closed questions, do, can, or are, or questions that require a yes or no answer. As the moderator, I'll be jumping in and I will ask people to rephrase their question. And if you don't want to rephrase your question, then you can't ask it. Or go to the next person. So at the end of this, when does the dialogue end? When I first started doing dialogues, the moderators said, the dialogue ends when we all die. Luckily enough, it's going to end when today's session ends, I think, when we all get a bit bored. But what I would maybe like you to all think about is what you feel the essence of the dialogue was, so what you feel the responses are, or if you felt that the Socratic dialogue was a bit crap. I do just have some reminders. Today is an experiment. It's little of no consequence if it doesn't work. We will see what happens, and if we don't like it, we can basically put it in our pocket and just build it into something the next time. I would also like to say that we're going to follow Chatham House rules. So I've seen during this conference that people have been taking photographs of some slides. I know some of the panelists do have some slides, but I would like it if you could maybe not do that. You're also welcome to share information that you've received after this conference, but please also keep the identity of who said them private. I think if you would like to develop it further, then you would have to contact the panelists separately. So thank you for that. And yes, it requires discipline. I think it can be very frustrating because a lot of people are used to a more conventional debating format, and they like to be able to talk when they want. But this is about listening to what is being said, and is about the removal of everyone's ego, which is always very exciting. And I know that some people definitely don't like it, but I'm moderating, so I don't care.
Is it about saving buildings, or is it about trying to strengthen society? So just because we retrofit something doesn't mean the outcomes for the people that use it are good, better, improved. So if it's only about make or mend, how do we know if it improves people's lives? So essentially, my point is we can't make decisions around make or mend unless we recognise that living well is about whole systems, and that we need to think about how we use infrastructure and buildings to improve outcomes and lives. It's how do we enable people to live well. Ta-da.
Thank you. You had 20 seconds left, so well done. I'm going to give everyone now, and this includes the audience, 1 minute to write down a question that they would like to potentially ask Alix a little bit later on. Please remember the format.
I think this is almost a criminal act, and certainly anti-conservation and anti-environmental. So how do we get out of that? Well, we left Europe in 2016, so we could obviously reform the whole thing immediately. But let's look at another thing. These are existing buildings, ex-council houses, tenement flats, often belonging to people with no great resources. But think of one in the St James Quarter of Edinburgh, built by a North Carolina pension fund, with over £1 trillion under management. And they hoped to sell this at a Singapore trade fair, but then COVID kind of got in the way. So they're selling it to even Scots are allowed to buy in the New Eden quarter. But that's the question I would raise, is how do we fight this discriminatory tax, often on quite poor people, on existing buildings, which are often of high conservation value?
We've talked about politics, we've talked about technology, we've talked about lots about economics, but we've got this, what psychologist Sally Weintraub calls a culture of uncare. So when you think about how we respond to demolition, like that's a huge amount of waste. So in the EU, we knock down the equivalent, a weight of 12,000 Eiffel Towers every single year. Of every kind of component that goes into a building, 1% of those is reused. So we waste 99%. So my question, kind of the question broadly, is really going to be like, what aspects of our culture of uncare do we need to unlearn so that stewardship becomes normal? So my kind of first example to go to story-wise would be, we have the block of flats in the Wynford, so we have 600 social homes. It's not just in a housing crisis, we're in a cost of survival crisis. So because of the insufficient maintenance carried out on our housing, around about 40% of all the money that any country spends on healthcare is because of our built environment. So this is a public health emergency. At the same time, in just under 1,000 days, so around 2026, the UK and EU construction industries use up their fair share of that 1.5 degrees budget. So historically, 92% of emissions that put us into this terrifying, fatal space that we're in came from the global north. So how can we possibly justify essentially colonizing the world again so we can look after ourselves? How do we do that in a just way? Because we cannot keep building new. It's a huge lack of imagination. If you're an architect and you look at a building that's already standing up, you've got all your constraints. We as human beings are more imaginative when we have constraints to work within.
This is just 10 things that have irritated me over the years that I thought I'm going to collect in one place and say, it's not true, it would be a good idea to retain buildings. So obviously I don't think you always retain buildings, but there are so many reasons that people find to get rid of them which are spurious in my opinion. Scale, we have no choice but to engage with retrofit, so we might as well do it well. I think we all know that. I think that's no longer the elephant in the room that it's been for so long. I'm pretty sure we're all comfortable with that. The other thing is that refurbishment is fundamentally cheaper than demolition and rebuild because most of the stuff's already there. And the work that Roger talked about was, we realised that the embodied carbon in retrofit is a smaller issue because there's less stuff. We need less stuff, it's less. But the point is that the money doesn't follow that. So it's what others have talked about. It's the financial structures mean that even if it was cheaper to refurbish, the only money they can get to do the work is for new build, and that's therefore what happens. And it's incredibly frustrating to be party to those conversations, which I have been to. And the thing I like about this graph, which is a Letty graph, and I have borrowed shamelessly for years now, is that you can see it is possible to get those green circles down to a point where retrofitted buildings are far more energy efficient than the reality of most new build. 50% of all Scotland's resources are used in construction and 50% of all waste, and that's obviously a bit of a vague thing, but the point is it's an enormous problem. I can't believe we're not doing more to it. This is a lovely piece of work that somebody who worked for us and now works for the National Trust did, showing that regeneration of areas is critically important, and regeneration of areas is even more important in areas of multiple deprivation, but it is harder financially to make the case for refurbishing buildings in areas of greater deprivation because there's less money to be made from doing so, and it disproportionately affects poorer areas as usual. This is a it's a subjective one, but I think everybody knows that the building on the left that was knocked down to make way for the building on the right is much nicer. Right?
And I prefer the UCN definition, which when applied to the built environment begs the question, what is it we wish to sustain, and does this intervention do that? How does this all relate to the topic of this conference and this session? We need to recognise that the vast majority of construction and demolition waste does not come from demolition of building structures in Scotland. The number of dwellings demolished each year in Scotland is around 0.5% of the current stock. In other words, at this rate, it will take 2 millennia to replace Scotland's housing. Most new homes are extra, not replacement. Meanwhile, we ignore the opportunities of converting empty non-domestic buildings into domestic buildings. I believe the majority of construction waste actually comes from the waste arising from new buildings and the process of refurbishing, altering and extending existing buildings. The latter often led by changing uses, fashion and consumerism rather than an improvement in environmental performance or a change of use to domestic. We must ask, what does this do to sustain? That doesn't mean I am minimising the issue of complete demolition. Far from it. In almost every case, existing buildings are part of the answer, not the problem.
I think I would like to posit that appropriate additions and adjustments are the way ahead in the mend, not necessarily make, but we know with an enlarging population we will be making more stuff. We have to be. And standards of living change, and people do expect more. So I think the refurbishment argument is very relevant for the existing stock, but we also need to take a template of development and construction typology to build new, and to build new sustainably for the increases of capacity or population that we almost definitely will have. And I think possibly instead of the standards being orientated towards operational performance, and low carbon necessarily, they're maximised towards indoor health. A caution with very narrow boundaries of retrofit to very tight metrics, specifically air tightness and high insulation values. They're not wrong in themselves, but when they become the dominant goal, I would suggest they lead us into certain directions which may not be able to afford and may have deleterious outcomes. And I think also a wider view of retrofit will free us from what I've called material capture, where essentially you have a very limited range of manufacturers imposing quite a narrow set of options on us, and changing that dynamic, changing the habits of those designing retrofit with such a limited material palette is actually very difficult. And you try suggesting something new to the construction industry. Good luck with that. Actually, we want to develop confidence, capacity, trust, and design decisions at the lowest possible level, at trade level, at designer level, less regulated by product coding, product guarantees, and more based on knowledge and understanding of the operatives, the designers, at all levels.
To make or to mend is kind of the subtitle to my entire career in architecture, because when I started off it was all about new build. That's all I did for, I'm sorry to say this, commercial property developers. And of course that was kind of how you learned a trade. You just had to learn how to be an architect, and I did that, and I learned to do that well, and then I learned to be more sustainable in doing that, and I learned to do that well. And then I gradually started working with existing buildings more and more. And interestingly, existing buildings are quite sophisticated. there are things to learn in all of these. There are lots of things which are not immediately obvious. And that's something eventually you learn to start looking for things and understanding. And maybe understanding is what's missing from this question, because this is a binary question, make or mend. So where you need to start from is actually understanding the beginning, what you've got. Many existing buildings, especially the heritage buildings, have evolved over a period of time. But even in their initial design, their construction, their maintenance has evolved. What we ended up with is something which has been the best solutions to how we deal with shelter, heating, lighting, ventilation, all of these things. But that seems to have been forgotten in the rush of new and better. And new and better doesn't always mean new and better. It just means different or fashionable. So things I have learned has been more to do with how to approach a building, how to work with a building, how to learn things. So I would put a wee bit in front of all of this question and say make or mend is the bit that should start with saying, this is written down so I remember it, learn, understand, act, evolve, and then you can understand whether you should make, whether you should mend, because the answer isn't one or the other, it's both. And knowing when's the right thing to do it is the hardest thing, because everyone's concerned about doing the wrong thing. So what we need to share is what we've learned, what can we do better, what actually maybe was the wrong thing entirely. And as part of the whole discussion, I'm really interested to hear what other people say, because everything that everyone said before me has been very valuable, but in reality, knowing when to act, when to change things, when to make and when to mend is the hardest thing of all. And it's the biggest lesson that we've got to learn.
Okay, time's up. We're now actually going to be moving into our first round of questions. So would any of our panelists like to volunteer to be the first person to ask a question? Otherwise, I will pick someone.
What is your view on the legitimacy of existing communities and how you build within those?
I guess my own personal perspective is that you can't just have one. We need to recognise that our communities don't all live in centres, and we need services, and we need services that support communities where they are. We need to go to them as well as, but we also do need to recognise that there's a lot of value in placing things in locations where transport infrastructure works towards, where we can continue to drive footfall to kind of save our city centres by also thinking about the diversification of what those centres can be.
Within the place-based process that you've described, what do you feel are the most effective ways of breaking down the silo thinking that we will inevitably come across?
Very good question. So I guess there's a number of things. So you have to think about everyone having an equal voice in the space, but there's also a space to share leadership of particular spaces.
What would be the impact on the buildings and construction industry if we were to ban any construction waste from being generated from any project from going to landfill, which is the construction equivalent of taking away the office waste bins?
That's a really good question. In the run-up to today's event, I tried to do a bit of digging to find out a bit more about actual waste demolition statistics and what's in them, quantification, where it comes from that. And I couldn't really find anything other than some UK stats about the total amount of arising, which claimed a huge amount of recycling, actually, but I suspect a lot of that was downcycling. I think I've long advocated a chain of custody within the building warrant system, so that when you put a building warrant in, you highlight if there's any arisings coming out from that work, what's going to happen. This will be reused, that will go off there, this will go here. If you had a complete ban, apart from industrial scale fly tipping, which we wouldn't want to see, it would be a severe constraint on the industry. Having said that, industry is actually quite good at solving problems in certain regard. I mean, it would solve it in the most practical, cost-efficient mechanism for them. We might find that actually, the law of unintended consequences creates a different problem.
This is probably a judicial question. Why don't we come down on people who demolish wonky pubs or neglect Grenfell Tower like a ton of bloody bricks? I mean, why don't we put people in prison for 5 years, you know, for breaking what should be a matter of law? I'm not trying to stir the pot here.
No, please stir the pot.
Chris or Alix?
Yes, who is that?
Chris, that was you. You just say yes.
You were saying, why don't we come down on people more seriously when they contravene obvious moral boundaries?
Yes.
I would broadly support doing that, but the only caveat, because I suppose that thing of you do get slightly wiser as you get older, and I hesitate to say, well, a little bit wiser as you get older, is that there are an awful lot of unintended consequences. And I've done over the years things that I thought were very smart, and they turned out to be not nearly as smart as I thought. So I think sort of straightforward, oh, that's ridiculous, let's ban it, just will cause other problems. So some degree of sensitivity to what might happen is the thing, but obviously I'm on your side with that.
Why do you think there is such widespread misunderstanding or misrepresentation of retrofit versus new build? Do you think it's a market conspiracy, or not? Maybe that's not the right word, but do you think it's driven by builders, or you know?
This is excellent because this was the subject of my final slide. And it's £10 well spent, Alix. Thank you for doing that. The number one is the thing that Scott said, is that people don't care very much about stuff that doesn't seem to appear. I mean, if I was asked what's the main problem, it's a lack of empathy. That is the main problem. We all are watching, really, as we see the world. And the two things that I think are also a problem before you get into market failures is that we don't understand old buildings. Most people don't understand them very well, so they sort of say, look, this sounds terribly complicated and expensive, let's just sort of not do this. And I think that that's an enormous underestimated sort of capacity that people have to not understand stuff. And I think we're incredibly risk averse these days, and it's desperately depressing. And so if you don't understand something and nobody around you seems to understand it, and it sounds like it might be expensive, we just don't go there.
But my question is, what changes would you make to the community right to buy legislation, and how would you support co-housing alternatives to the current, or some of the current ownership models?
I think in terms of the community right to buy, it has to go to the community gets first. Not just like they get first say, but they don't, it's not off the value of perspective. It's not off the value of what someone else could get, what someone else could cram onto it, what some developer can build terrible student housing onto a land bank. How do we start to share this more openly in open source ways?
Well, we're full of a room full of people here who've got very good experience, and it'd be good to get it beyond this room would be step number one. This is part of the question I was going to ask, so I might as well answer it myself. We do have lots of people with lots of good experience of construction, retrofit, maintenance, all of these things. And all the things that we're talking about today don't need to start from the beginning. What we need to do is use the experience of people who have been doing this already, but maybe don't think that they're part of the answer. And that includes modern construction, and that includes the workforce that's already trained up to work on buildings. Because they've got the skills, they're maybe just not directing them in the right way, is my humble opinion. Being able to allow people to share their experiences is very powerful, and that happens at every level. So some of the benefits, when Paul was talking earlier about the Glasgow Housing, the Community Housing Association starting, it flourished whenever the first housing association people said, here's what we've been doing, this is what we've learned, this is what we've changed, and that all of a sudden then triggered off many others been formed. So the important thing is to stand up and say, this is what I've learned, this is what I think you'll find interesting, which is what SEDA is all about, bringing it back to the conference. But I'd like to see that happening on a more professional level. I'd like to see that happening from everyone being trained from coming out of school. In fact, another one, Paul was saying, how do you get people interested in construction? I'll give you an easy answer. Summertime DIY clubs teach anybody who wants to learn how to do simple repairs of their buildings using the school buildings that you've got with all the people accessible. From anybody who wants to teach, set up summertime clubs, everybody learns. Share the experiences, good and bad, don't be afraid to talk about it. A question for Roger. How can we incentivise reuse of existing and or heritage buildings when there's so many perceived problems like costs, maintenance, operational, lack of space, lack of comfort? And you can answer it in a heritage context, that would be fine.
That. But also, this is a skills opportunity. 20% of the housing stock is pre-1919. Quite a lot of it is still traditionally built up to whenever. So I think there's a huge skills opportunity. You can't get trades to do work now. Architects here will know that, or it's very difficult. So I think you perhaps cloak the refurbishment, and we accept there is going to be change to the historic environment. You know, we live differently, we operate differently. Of course, there's change, and that's what listed building consent is there for, to manage change appropriately. And I'd like to think LBC now has a greater environmental overlay within it, and certainly elements of HES grants now will support insulation and other things as part of a bigger scheme. So I think it's accepting that change is going to come. Let's remember the listed building thing is quite small, 1%. You know, this is not a blocker on a national retrofit priority. It's a factor, but not a blocker. But I do think the VAT one, I don't want to keep coming back to it, but I think that is quite a big part of enabling people to move forward with retrofit, reuse, reoccupation, rehabilitation. But I think it needs to be grassroots. It's got to be, and I think if it's tied in with the retrofit agenda, that's the way to use that, the carbon that one can save by getting that right as part of accelerating the retrofit imperative.